All right, one step closer. Move that over there. Okay, and let's go ahead and get the correct screen to be shared. Very nice. All right. I like when technology cooperates. So we have rather a lot of material to cover tonight, unfortunately. So we are going to go ahead and get started. As much as I like to leave a buffer, I don't want to lose any of the valuable time we have, given that we have a rather large topic. All of our topics are large, but this one is not only large, but complicated, and one that, especially if you are considering becoming Jewish, it's very important to know. Very important to know and understand, as it will be very significant in any decisions you make. And that, of course, as you can see from the screen, is the topic of anti-Semitism, or as it might be called, Jew hatred. Now, the reason why I'm including that other title, Jew hatred, is because sometimes anti-Semitism almost seems like a antiseptic term for what is a insidious and vile behavior. When someone says racist or when someone says chauvinist, it has a little bit more of a clear understanding of exactly who's being targeted. Anti-Semitism, on the other hand, well, the word Semitism is so distant from the concept of Jews just by the term itself, not a term that we chose for ourselves, that it is, well, easy to slip by. Thankfully, many people are active in defending against anti-Semitism, but I want to make sure that we understand that this is one of the many types of hatred that different people in the world hold. And it is a type of hatred that is very old and a type of hatred that has many different flavors to it. And so, we're going to look at some of those different flavors, some of the different history, and some of the different ways that we can understand and respond to anti-Semitism. So let's talk about the different types of anti-Semitism that all exist and have existed throughout history. The three most common, prominent, and powerful forms of anti-Semitism over the last 3,000 years are cultural anti-Semitism, theological anti-Semitism, and racial anti-Semitism. Although, as I'll point out, racial anti-Semitism is very recent as far as anti-Semitism goes. Indeed, race as a category of hate is much newer than you might imagine. And finally, we will also look tonight at anti-Semitism, which comes under the guise of anti-Israelism, for people that are opposed to Israel, but their opposition is not opposition, but is in fact hatred. And we'll talk about how to distinguish between opposition and hatred when it comes to Israel a little bit further on. So let's take a look at these different forms and break them down into their pieces. Oh, stop. My mouse is really trying to flip me through more than one slide at a time. I apologize. So cultural excuse me, still just getting over the cold. My throat's not entirely clear. Cultural anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism which is opposed. Did I skip one? Yes, I did. Cultural anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism that is opposed to Judaism as a way of life. That is to say, they look at what the Torah has given to us, what our traditions ask of us, and they say that the life that it actually creates is wrong in and of itself, or at the very least is inferior to whatever form of culture and lifestyle they prefer. For example, you might attack Judaism on the grounds that it is lazy, because after all, we give 1/7 of our life to no work. We call that Shabbat. You might call it legalistic or argumentative, because you believe that for some reason having well thought out and rational debates is a sign of rebelliousness or of audacity or arrogance, and instead you should simply do as you're told. Or you might be opposed to Judaism on cultural grounds simply because it is not your culture. It is a different version of a culture, and many people, unfortunately, throughout history, have hated other cultures simply for the crime of being different. Now, these attacks have been around for a very long time. Indeed, they come well before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years ago, and form one of the major motivations for the wars of the Maccabees, the wars that led to the eventual holiday of Hanukkah, which we are in the middle of celebrating. It was our resistance to the Hellenizing influence of not influence, that's putting it too mild, the Hellenizing proclamations and requirements of the Seleucid Empire that led to us rebelling against Antiochus. So this type of cultural anti-Semitism has been around really from the very beginning. In fact, if we go back to an Egyptian source from the 3rd century BCE, known as Manetho, he taught that we didn't escape from Egypt, that we were kicked out of Egypt, and that we were lepers, and that we had been taught by Moses not to adore the gods. Again, we can see here a combination of cultural anti-Semitism, that we are despicable, lowly people, as well as theological anti-Semitism, that Jews are bad because they don't worship the same gods as the Egyptians. Roman writers, a little bit later on, would also speak unfavorably of us for cultural reasons. Again, much like in the time of the Maccabees, this was partly because we rejected the Hellenistic culture. We weren't so big on gladiatorial contests after all, but it was also because we remained a thorn in their side, constantly advocating and even rebelling multiple times to try and gain our freedom from their empire. And in fact, every time they defeated us, they would celebrate in quite grandiose fashion, in many ways disproportionate to the threat that we represented. But they were able to understand that indeed the culture of Judaism and its desire for personal freedom and independence from the imperial rule of Rome was a bigger danger. If other nations had had similar ideas that this type of foreign autocracy should be pushed back, the Roman Empire would never have been able to withstand the pressure from all of its provinces. So they were not a big fans of Jews either. And if you go to Rome today, you'll see the Arch of Titus and you'll see the Colosseum, both of which were constructed in celebration and with the money taken from the defeat of the Jewish rebellion. And the mouse is really driving me mad today. There we go. Right? Yes. In the Enlightenment, which is to say the 1800s, something that we talked about in our last class, talking about the different movements, the different denominations of Judaism, cultural anti-Semitism took on a new flavor, a new species, and a new pain. We can read here from Johann David Michaels in 1782, writing, "Does the law of Moses, meaning Torah, make citizenship and the full integration of the Jew into other peoples difficult or impossible? I think it does. The purpose of this law is to maintain the Jews as a people almost completely separate from other peoples, and this purpose is an integral part of all the laws, down to those concerning kosher and non-kosher food, with the result that the Jews have lived as a separate group during 1700 years of dispersion." Now, he says that like a bad thing. The fact that we have been able to maintain our identity and maintain our sense of self throughout 1700 years of dispersion, I think would be a claim to the superlative qualities of the Jewish culture. However, as the Enlightenment endeavor was trying to understand what citizenship meant when it didn't rely solely on being a subject of a king, but instead would be wrapped within other cultural ties, this alarmed many people in Europe that the Jews would never properly fit in. Now, you may notice that even if the country might be predominantly Protestant or Catholic, that eventually the Europeans were able to make room for the people of other Christian faiths within their borders. No such leniency was offered to the Jews. Instead, many cultural anti-Semites believed that we would always remain too distinct, too different to ever be considered a full and equal citizen within their country. And as such, we should either be kept in second-class citizenship and denied a vote or other rights, or expelled from the country altogether. Now, cultural anti-Semitism also was reflected in a negative way by those who defended us. And here we have Christian Wilhelm von Dohm, also in the 1700s, writing, he thinks, in our favor. But impartiality would demand that if a Jewish and a Christian applicant showed equal capability, the latter, meaning the Christian person, deserves preference. This seems to be an obvious right of the majority in the nation, meaning that it's perfectly normal and right to have a majority discriminate against a minority, at least until the Jews, by wiser treatment, meaning until we smarten up, are changed into entirely equal citizens and all differences polished off. For all these reasons, and trusting that human nature is the same in all people, I am convinced that in a few generations, the Jews will be just like all the other citizens in those states which will grant them equal rights. So Van Dohm is trying to be supportive of us, but as you can see, his assumption behind why he wants to be supportive is that if you take a Jew and remove everything culturally Jewish about him or her, then they will be just like everyone else, and then we can accept them. But as long as their culture remains distinct or different in any way, shape, or form from that of the Christian majority of Europe, then, of course, they should be denied equal rights, because how could you ever expect to accept and show equal treatment to somebody that was different? And remember, this was somebody who considered himself an ally of the Jews at the time, offering tolerance for our existence as long as we would eventually come to the right conclusions. It was things like this, of course, that we talked about in last session's class that led many people to embrace a spirit of reformation in Judaism to indeed try to polish off the differences. Now, the forms of cultural anti-Semitism have a couple of recurring themes. One that has been perhaps most pernicious is the idea that Jews are greedy, that Jews are crooked in business, that we are obsessed with money, that we are cheap and selfish. Now, the origin of that particular stereotype has the roots within early mercantile trade connections that existed among the different Jewish groups that were scattered around the many parts of the Mediterranean and Near East. That allowed us to have trade that was often outside the capability of either Muslim or Christian European traders, simply because a merchant in France could have a connection with a merchant in Egypt, something that the other two faiths found much harder to establish in the early days of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. However, at the same time that we did have some of those connections, that is to say, a few of our people had those connections, there were also far fewer jobs available to us, especially within Europe. Jews were often not allowed to own land. We were often not allowed to join guilds. We were often not allowed to do work that would be for any church business. And the church was a big business, a huge landowner, and also, of course, had many building projects. So at the same time that we had some advantages with regards to international trade, we had very few advantages with regards to local business opportunities. That meant that we had a surplus of currency, but often often lacked places where we could put that currency into local business. One job that we could do was to take those assets and turn them into more assets through the process of loaning. This was something that Christian Europe was reluctant to do and had their own laws about prohibiting it, but Jews were allowed to loan in this way to non-Jews at the time. And indeed, it was one of the few beneficial type of situations that we could actually have. However, over time, people might have been very happy to take our money, but they were very unhappy to pay it back. And the nobility in particular often found ways to expel us from their areas when it came time to repay the loan. At the same time, other more people of more modest means might find it easier to blame the Jew for their current economic problems and poverty rather than the Lord or others that had taxed them or taken the money from them under the force of arms. And as such, we had this reputation. However, at any time, it was always a small percentage of Jews that were involved in such trade. And to this day, Jews are not especially in possession of more wealth or exhibit any additional greed or selfishness in their personalities. Theological anti-Semitism is a very different species. Now, hate is hate, but understanding the origin of hate is important. And theological anti-Semitism attacks Judaism not because of our culture and because of our way of life, but because of our stated beliefs, that is to say, monotheism. And obviously in the ancient world, as reflected throughout the Torah and the rest of Tanakh, there was a great deal of antagonism between our vision of monotheism, that there is only one God, and the vision of polytheism among the pagan pantheons of the idolaters that surrounded us. However, as paganism waned and Christianity and Islam gained, you might have thought that we would find natural allies and that this form of theological anti-Semitism would disappear. Unfortunately not. Under Christianity, both Catholicism at first and later Protestantism, when it was created, found reason to hate the Jews for our refusal to accept Jesus. At the same time as they decided that we must be hated for refusing to accept Jesus, it was also a very important part of spreading the Christian faith to explain that the Jews, who were, after all, the home nation from which Jesus came, how we could be explained to those that they were trying to convert. If you go to a pagan, for example, among the Romans, and say you should worship Jesus, the first thing a Roman is going to say is, well, why don't the Jews worship Jesus? If the Jews don't accept somebody who came from their own people, why should I, a Roman, accept somebody who came from their people? And so there had to be an explanation. This became known as a replacement theology or supersessionist theology, meaning that Christianity has taken the place of Jews. That Judaism has lost its covenant with God, that Judaism is a stiff-necked and rebellious group of people who refuse to listen to God. And in fact, you can see from our suffering what happens if you ignore Jesus and Christianity. And we do see a similar response within the Muslim world when the Jews refused to accept the Quran and to accept Muhammad as a prophet. But turning to Christianity, if we look at the words of St. Augustine, one of the early Christian writers who really encapsulated and quite literally canonized the Jew hatred within Christianity, we can see the makings of his anger. The church admits and avows the Jewish people to be cursed because after killing Christ, they continued to till the ground of an earthly circumcision, an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover, while the hidden strength or virtue of making known Christ. The Jewish people, like Cain, continue tilling the ground in the carnal observance of the law, which does not yield to them its strength because they do not perceive in it the grace of Christ. To try and translate very early church father writings into some form of modern English, what he is saying is that because we continue to keep the commandments that God said were forever, that shows our rebelliousness against God, in particular Jesus, arguing that if you accepted Jesus, you would no longer need to consider the commandments, the earthly aspects, our physical actions, as being important, because it is through the grace of Jesus that you are redeemed, not through the acts of observance of the commandments. So our idea, which came from the Torah originally, that a person can be a good person by following the commandments, was an obvious challenge to the idea that you could only be redeemed through an acceptance of Jesus. Therefore, by definition, St. Augustine had to reject Judaism as a valid form of religious expression. He goes on, Judaism, since Christ, is a corruption, Indeed, Judas, picking one of the different disciples of Jesus, all of whom were Jewish, but picking one that, of course, has a bad reputation. Judas is the image of the Jewish people. Their understanding of Scripture is carnal, meaning about the physical world. They bear the guilt for the death of the Savior, for through their fathers they have killed Christ. And this, of course, comes to a common refrain that Jews are Christ killers, that we are responsible for the death of Jesus. Now, there are a couple different ways to interpret the passages in the Christian Bible which try to blame the Jewish people for the death of Jesus, but it is really a stretch to say that we are the ones who killed him when it was a Roman punishment and a Roman execution and a Roman death is a bit problematic. But then if you are trying to convert the Roman Empire, focusing on the Jews, who we all know were trouble to the Romans as well, as the cause of Jesus's death, makes a much better commercial than saying, hey, Romans, come join our religion, you know, the one that started when you killed our God. That does not sell quite so well. And so indeed, the shift of blame from the Romans to the Jews happened very early in the Christian era in order to try and make this more palatable to a wider audience. Now, in case you think that this is merely an ancient form of Jewish hatred, we can look as recently as 2010 from a mainstream group. There are plenty of non-mainstream groups that spout Jewish hatred all the time. Unfortunately, you can find many of them on YouTube, where this video will go up. But even among the mainstream groups, we can find statements as follows. We Christians cannot speak of the promised land as an exclusive right for a privileged Jewish people. This promise was nullified by Christ. In the kingdom of God, there is no longer a chosen people. So from the Synod of Bishops, when they were trying to speak in a way to advocate for peace, they perhaps inadvertently, although I'd imagine this was composed with some consideration and carefulness, they nonetheless continue the supersessionist idea that the Jewish people have no special relationship, no special connection, no special covenant, because all of that was dissolved with the coming of Jesus. Therefore, we now become superfluous or perhaps even rebellious. And like I said, this was said in a document that was not intended to be antagonistic or hateful. And yet you can see the underlying assumptions that are built into many people's attitudes because of the assumed theological problems that they have with Judaism and Jewish people. We simply don't fit into their theological framework. How much we don't fit, I will give a little bit of an example that is not on the page, but it is important to recognize that the Catholic Church in particular, in the 20th century and on into the 21st, has tried to rectify some of the hateful ideas within their theology towards Judaism. In fact, there is now a Catholic position, which has been promulgated by the papal authorities, that Jews are not to be considered damned for their rejection of Catholicism. Why we're not supposed to be damned, how it is that we can exist without the grace of Jesus and the Catholic rituals, that they claim to be one of the great mysteries of God, meaning they've decided that they shouldn't hate us. And in order to not hate us, they have to say we're not damned forever for simply being us. But why we're not damned, they have a hard time explaining. And as such, we are left not as hated as ever, which is good, as there have been so many centuries of hatred against Jews that were promulgated through the Catholic Church. And indeed, in many parts of the world, unfortunately, many Catholic priests continue to spout hatred, but it's still a flawed tolerance at best. In particular, throughout Europe, one of the forms of hatred that was most common and most insidious was that of what was called a blood libel. Now, this lie occurred over and over again, but the basic idea was that since we don't have the blood of Jesus, we need the blood of a Christian in order to bring about our redemption. Now, this is, of course, against all Jewish law, And this lie has been promulgated by people who know nothing of Judaism and can obviously and easily be disproven. However, since when is hate ever going to allow facts to get in the way of the hate? Now, this became most common in the Middle Ages, but we can see from Democritus that all the way back in the 4th century BCE, that there was a belief that Jews would capture somebody and take them to Jerusalem and sacrifice them and use their flesh as part of our sacrifice. No one seems to mind that this is completely against the Torah. They seem to think we'll do it anyway. Notice how the inconsistency of anti-Semitism says that at once we are slavish adherents to a physical law, that we continue to follow our distinct laws that refuse to allow ourselves to integrate into society, and yet we are also being accused of things that are the exact opposite of our law, which if we were slavishly following would make such a thing completely impossible. We also know during the Maccabees Wars that there was a belief that we were sacrificing people as well. However, really the blood libel took off and has continued to be a permanent part of the anti-Semites' imagination. In 1144 in England, there was a child named William in the city of Norwich who went missing, and it was claimed by someone who was probably the murderer that an international group of Jews had decided to kill the child in order to bring about our redemption to Israel. This led to the process that would eventually culminate in our expulsion from England, along with many other anti-Semitic and other problems within the British realm. But the idea of this blood libel has continued to be an ongoing danger. And during Passover time in particular, when people think we need the blood for our matzah, Jews have become very worried about the mobs that have ransacked Jewish towns. All right, well, actually, before we go into the racist forms of anti-Semitism, I'm just going to give a quick pause. I've been talking for almost a half an hour straight, and I want to check if we have any questions on the first two. These are the older versions of anti-Semitism, but they are still around. But I want to make sure that we're clear on them before we get into the more modern versions. Okay, so let's talk about racial anti-Semitism. First of all, racial anti-Semitism doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Let's understand what they talk about it before we push back, though. So in the 1800s in particular, we had a rise of biology, and we had the rise of Darwinism, and the idea of evolution that was misused. I believe in evolution, but I don't believe in the evolution the way these people used it, to think that race, meaning the physical characteristics, the biology and DNA, as it would eventually become identified, was something that could be used as an excuse to hate, despise, and eventually in the Holocaust, destroy many, many millions of people. Now, unlike the earlier forms of anti-Semitism, cultural and theological, a Jew has no hope of escaping these racial charges. You can't convert, you cannot renounce your peoplehood, you can't change your behaviors. If you are part of a race, you are stuck being part of that race. This is something that anybody who has experienced racism of any variety will be well aware of. And of course, is one of the most evil parts of the lie of race and racial hatred in all of its forms. Now, we can see in the words of Adolf Hitler most clearly what this racial idea looks like and why it has become so problematic and so persistent. So this is from an interview with Adolf Hitler. Gobineau and Chamberlain were inspired by our concept of a new order, or if you prefer, an ideological glimpse into history in accordance with the basic principle of blood. So Hitler is bragging about how easily the French and British were able to grasp this idea that blood, genetics, is really what's important. We do not judge by merely artistic or military standards, or even by purely scientific ones. We judge by the spiritual energy which a people is capable of putting forth, which will enable it in 10 years to recapture what it has lost in 1,000 years of warfare. I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in battle is a fellow fighter for a unique spiritual, I would almost say divine creation. So Hitler really believed that there was a principle of blood that had a spiritual, a powerful energy that was going to revolutionize and change the world. There was, of course, a problem, and that was the Jews, that we exist. As he says in Mein Kampf, the Jew has always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never a religion, which, of course, is not what we believe, but that was his belief. Only in order to get ahead, he early sought for a means which could distract unpleasant attention from his person. And what would have been more expedient and at the same time more innocent than the embezzled concept of a religious community? So the idea that he is spouting here is that we are not a religion, but we are this devious race that hide behind the illusion of being a religion, a concept that we stole from others. For here too, everything is borrowed, or rather stolen. Due to his own original special nature, the Jew cannot possess a religious institution, if for no other reason, because he lacks idealism in any form, and hence belief in a hereafter is absolutely foreign to him. And a religion in the Aryan sense cannot be imagined which lacks the conviction of survival after death in some form. First of all, as we'll talk about in our end of days discussion, we do believe in a life after death. We believe quite strongly in that. But more to the point, his idea was that we were racially, genetically incapable of such ideas or incapable of such attitudes that would lead to what he defined as being good. You can begin to see the problem. You cannot convert away from this. You cannot leave behind your wrong ideas. If you believe that the Jew is endowed by their blood or lacks because of their blood certain characteristics, then the only option you have is to exterminate it. You cannot reform a Jew any more than you can reform a virus. He continues, "It is true we Germans are barbarians. That is an honored title to us. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, from the degrading suffering caused by the false vision called conscience and ethics. The Jews have inflicted two wounds on mankind, circumcision on its body, always a common complaint among the anti-Semites, that they're very, very upset that we do circumcision, and conscience on its soul. They are Jewish inventions. The war for the domination of the world is waged only between these two camps alone, the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception." Now, I don't know about you, but I, for one, consider this to be an incredible compliment to the Jewish people. It's not entirely true that we invented the idea of a conscience, but if somebody wanted to say that the Jews have been willing to carry the banner of conscience, being willing to carry the banner of ethics into the world, despite the worst situations that we have had to endure, I will own up to that, and I will carry that flag. But of course, those that were espousing this idea of racial dominance believed in the domination part of racial dominance. And that means that you cannot have a conscience or ethics, but must instead act only by the urge to power and the urge to domination. And if you have a group of people, us, that seem incapable genetically of letting go of this idea of conscience and ethics, then obviously from Hitler's deranged point of view, we will forever be the enemy of the German idea of domination. He was right that we are implacably opposed to people who think the domination of the world is the correct path, but he is wrong when he continues to say that this is because of our blood. Whoop. Let's see if we can stop on, sorry, there we go. And lest you think that with the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, that this form of hatred and racial prejudice has gone away, we have a couple pictures here taken from very recent years and recent events, just giving a little bit of a taste of the idea, as you can see on the left, that Camp Auschwitz, that we should be supporting the work of the gas chambers. And on the right, the abbreviation 6MWE, it stands for 6 million wasn't enough. with the eagle standing over the symbol of fascism, the bound bundle of sticks together with the axe. This form of fascist idealism and of anti-Semitic hatred through racial typing is unfortunately alive and well. Now, just to make sure everyone understands that despite the fact that there are people who oppose Judaism and hate us on the grounds of race, we are not a race. Right? The whole idea of race as a genetic idea is a little bit slippery by itself, but within Judaism, a person can be Jewish no matter what their genetic makeup is. There are no Jewish genes. A person can be Jewish and come from any country of the world. A person can be Jewish and can come from any so-called race of the world, any color of skin, any style of hair, any facial or bodily features. Anyone can be Jewish. And in fact, there are people from every walk of life, every country of origin, and every racial typing that you can imagine that are Jewish. And they are part of our people, and they will continue to be part of our people. So the idea of Judaism as a race at all is simply ridiculous, but unfortunately, we don't set the terms of how someone else chooses to hate us. So we do need to be aware that we are treated as a race by the racists. And as such, we need to be able to respond to that and to recognize it and call it for what it is. This is a form of racism. Even if we don't claim to be a race, the people who are perpetrating these acts of hate are racists against us. You may have noticed throughout our discussion this evening that anti-Semitism is very flexible. That is to say, we are a beautiful template onto which anyone's fear and hate can be projected. If you go back and look through just recent history, you'll find that those that are fighting against capitalism, the communist and socialist revolutions of the 1800s and 1900s, they will cast the Jews as being capitalists. And those that were fighting against communism within the capitalist countries of the world will cast the Jews as being communist infiltrators. You may recognize that it is impossible for us to be both. But again, this was in the eyes of those that hated us, not in the eyes of any rational analysis. When people were fighting to keep racism going, they will, when people are, when racists are fighting to keep their status, they will label us as fighting against the purity of the white nation. Indeed, if you remember the Charlottesville chant, Jews will not replace us, that was not saying that we were taking their place, but it goes to this idea that we are somehow trying to infect America by bringing in other races to replace the white majority. That is our nefarious scheme, they seem to believe. Of course, if people are fighting against civil rights abuses and racism, unfortunately, many of those are still anti-Semitic, and Jews are racists at the same time. So both the racists consider us to be anti-racists, and both the anti-racists consider us to be racist. And more recently, as the world has had collapse in the economic system, and now as we have been fighting with the issues of COVID, we are again being blamed for both the economic collapse or that we are being blamed for COVID as part of our international plot to take over the world. And more recently, it's gone even into a new flavor. You may have heard of some of the different QAnon theories and different conspiracies. And it is really just a greatest hits of the hate over the last couple thousand years, taking the idea of secret Jewish groups, of satanic children harming rituals, of people using the blood, and all of these things are just rehashing Jewish hatred, sometimes pointing it against others, but very often pointing it against Jews as well. This is not even an original version of anti-Semitism, but it has been given new labels and new life in the last few years. And as such, it should come as no surprise that over the last few years, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States has been continuing to rise fairly steadily. Anti-Semitism is on the upswing. When I was in Baltimore back in 2006, which is not even on this chart, there was no need for a security guard at our 800 family shul. By 2000, and I guess it was about 14, 15 here in Orlando, we were now having security at all of our events. It is because, unfortunately, the hate has continued to rise. And the hate against us, stop it, mouse. Excuse me. Trying to use the scrolling wheel to make it work, but maybe I should use the keyboard instead. I'll eventually figure things like that. The hatred against us is, unfortunately, a disproportionate amount of the hatred against people for religions. Among all of the hate crimes that are committed in our country, from the most recent statistics I could find, as you can see, it is almost 3-to-1 that amongst the attacks that are against Jews, as opposed to the next most targeted group. And in fact, more attacks have been made against Jews than any other religious group combined within this country. This is, of course, despite the fact that we are a tiny, tiny minority in the United States. Now, I don't want you to go away being completely depressed from this. So you do need to understand, however, that although anti-Semitic attacks have risen, and although we continue to be the primary focus of religious-based hate crimes, the actual number of people who hold anti-Semitic opinions and ideas has continued to drop. Here on the left-hand side in 1964, we can see that at least a third of the country was perfectly fine being anti-Semitic, overtly and clearly saying that they hated Jews. By the time we have reached the most recent statistics I could find in 2019, we see that only 11% of the country are willing to admit such things. And I consider that to be staggeringly good progress. It is unfortunate that many people continue to be very loud, but they are a decreasing proportion of the population, if not a smaller portion of the noise being generated. Any questions before we move on to anti-Israelism?
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have to disagree with you about your last statement that
Yes.
it has gone down. Maybe you're right. Outwardly it is. But I have experienced anti-Semitism from my book club group, from some of my closest friends who didn't even realize they were saying something anti-Semitic. And part of the reason for that is that I fit in with them and they forget. And I've seen people forget that somebody actually was of the Black race because they were so comfortable with them, and they would make an outward statement without even realizing what they were saying. My feeling is that it may not be as outwardly shown, but it continues to be an undercurrent. That's my point.
I wouldn't call that a disagreement, because I'm going to talk a little bit later on about casual anti-Semitism, which is what you're describing. At this point, I'm talking about overt and embraced. I would be willing to bet that the people that you reference would be surprised to realize that statements they made were considered anti-Semitic. And that is something that we still have a lot of work to do. Like I mentioned before, when referring to the Synod of Bishops, I'm sure the people who wrote that would not call themselves anti-Semitic. But then that has become a common refrain. Many people will say, oh, well, I'm not racist because I didn't mean to be racist. But that form of casual hate, whether it be about a race or a religion, is still a very real problem. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides.
Okay, thank you.
All right, but before we can get to the forms of casual anti-Semitism, let's talk about one of the major avenues of anti-Semitism that has grown in the 20th century, and that is anti-Israelism. So I need to say from the very, very beginning, before we go further, it is perfectly fine to love Israel and to still criticize her government or specific policies of a particular government. Now, that doesn't mean that you should criticize everything and all of that, but just understand that the vast majority of Israelis did not vote for their current prime minister. In fact, only 6% of the people in Israel voted to make the current Prime Minister Bennett their prime minister. The rest voted for other parties, and the way the coalition government worked out, he is now the prime minister. Now, that does not mean that 94% of the people in the state of Israel are anti-Semites because they wished someone else was in charge. It doesn't mean that all the parties that vote against the different bills that are being advanced by the current government are anti-Semitic. If it did, then Likud or the ultra-religious parties that are not in the coalition would have to be labeled as anti-Semitic. And that is simply unreasonable. Being a critic of Israel, either of the particular government or particular policies, is not incompatible with loving Israel and wanting what is best for her. Indeed, that's what each person does of any country. They love the country as well as try to argue about what is the best path forward. So it is perfectly fine to love Israel and criticize the government or policies. However, there are ways to do it that are okay and ways that are not okay. And I'm going to make it easy to tell the difference by just asking a few questions, meaning that if you feel like criticizing something in Israel, ask yourself these 4 simple questions, and you'll be able to tell whether or not your criticism comes from a place of respect and concern for what you hope Israel will do, or whether your question and criticism comes from a place of anger or hate. So first, is the criticism that you are leveling against Israel only aimed at Israel? Or do you also aim the same criticism, out loud, against other countries that do likewise? For example, if you want to criticize Israel because of its treatment of Palestinians, whatever you may imagine that to be, are you also an equal critic of all of the other countries around the world that also do things that perhaps might be considered unfair to their minorities? If the answer is no, then you have to ask yourself, why am I only concerned about what Israel does in its situation? 2, is the critic, if you are asking this question, are you able to acknowledge anything that is positive about the policies of Israel that deserve praise? Can you say, I don't like what they do X, Y, and Z, but I have to admit their recent treaty with Jordan to exchange desalinated water for energy, that makes a lot of sense, and it's good for both countries. Can you say, I'm glad that they are able to find ways to stop fighting with Egypt and to have a peace treaty? Are you able to say that they are doing a good job on certain environmental measures? Not everyone, but some of them. Can you say they handled COVID fairly well? Can you say that they have a great deal of positive policies for people of different gender identities and gender expressions? If you are unable to acknowledge anything that is positive within Israel, then you again have to begin to wonder, are you actually looking at the policies of the country, or are you simply angry and hateful to the country, and more importantly, the people of the country? Number 3 is perhaps the best way to test. Is the person presenting an alternative policy? If someone says, and we're going to look at a few examples, Israel is disproportionate in responding to terror. Israel needs to provide more freedom. Israel needs to stop the occupation. Those are great taglines and look fine in a tweet, but what actual policy alternative is being suggested? Are they saying that when rockets fly from Gaza, Israel should do nothing? Are they saying that if terrorists cross the border and kidnap people, that Israel should do nothing? When they say Israel should end the occupation, do they mean Israel should withdraw all people and troops from the West Bank, having already done so, I should remind everyone, from Gaza? Or do they mean all Jews should leave all of Israel, from the river to the sea, as people like to chant, and go somewhere else? Usually when you get a person to begin to outline what they want the future to look like, it becomes apparent whether they are looking for a peaceful coexistence among different people, or whether they are looking for the elimination, eradication, or exile of all Jews. And obviously, once they move into that second category, then it becomes clear that you are dealing with anti-Semitism, not a legitimate criticism of Israel. And question number 4, is all violence against Israel justified, no matter how indiscriminate? If you really can say without blushing that blowing up a bus, blowing up a kindergarten, firing rockets into a civilian area is perfectly fine because you're only killing the Jews, then you might want to check whether or not you are engaging in hatred rather than a proper consideration of how a country handles difficult circumstances. Again, it is perfectly fine to criticize if you are avoiding all of these pitfalls. And indeed, within Israel, you have a wide range of different opinions and arguments about the best way to handle all the issues I've already mentioned. That doesn't mean that those people are bad, but unfortunately, a large number of people fail on one or all of these questions when it comes to their attitude towards Israel. From 2019, I have my favorite example. In 2019, Israel was given the opportunity to host the Eurovision Song Contest. That was because their singer had won the previous year's contest. Now, when that was released, that Israel was going to be the host because of their victory, many people immediately said that Israel should not be allowed to host, that it should be moved to another venue, or that all the countries of Europe should boycott and not participate in 2019 because it would mean going to Israel for the program. However, at that same time, or in that same program, Azerbaijan, who had won earlier, they were also given the opportunity to host, and no one mentioned a word about not going to Azerbaijan or not allowing Azerbaijan to host, even though it was in the very same year that the European Commission on Human Rights condemned them for their staggering violations of their citizens' rights. So the hypocrisy is rather rank and is something that must be noticed and called out. So let's just talk about a few of the specific issues that sometimes come up and a few ways that we need to respond and understand. So the first that you will often hear is that Israel's occupation of the West Bank or Gaza is illegal under international law. I will again remind you, Israel does not have any troops in Gaza. They, in fact, gave full territorial autonomy to Gaza, which then elected Hamas, the terrorist organization, to be their government. And then after Hamas launched attacks, Israel put them under an embargo in order to prevent more arms coming in. But facts aside, let's look at the actual technicality of this. Technically, no. Israel does not occupy the West Bank, nor did it occupy Gaza. A state can only occupy land under international law if it was land that belonged to another state. As the Palestinians have never been a state, and Jordan and Egypt, who both did claim the lands of the West Bank and Gaza, respectively, have since renounced those claims, the best term would be disputed territories, which indeed there are numerous disputed territories around the world. And as I mentioned, Gaza is no longer under rule. So really, the proper phrase should be disputed territories. And under international law, you can continue to maintain security and safety in disputed territories. And there is no illegality from that position. Many people also claim, because of Israel, millions of Palestinians are refugees. Now, this is true to a certain degree, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were indeed left stateless because of the war waged by the Arab states in 1948 when Israel declared its independence. And it is true that many of those refugees have remained stateless because neither other Arab states have absorbed them, nor have they been willing to establish a peaceful state for themselves. Israel, at the same time that these refugees were leaving Israel, Israel has absorbed as many or more refugees, Jewish refugees, who came from the Arab states, where they were expelled by the Arab countries throughout the Middle East because of Israel's existence. So those 750,000 Jews that were kicked out of other Arab states are no longer called refugees because they were absorbed and made full citizens within Israel, and allowed to continue their life. Unfortunately, the other Arab states have not treated the Palestinians likewise and have perhaps a vested interest in maintaining them as a stateless population that are often used for propaganda purposes. Other people will point out that conditions in Gaza and the West Bank are appalling. And indeed, they are not as good as they should be, but they are also far from the worst conditions in the world. Life expectancy, education, income are more are higher than many other countries, despite a 25% unemployment. And Israel, too, is not all that she can be. The conditions within Israel are less ideal than they could be because she has to spend so much on maintaining her defense and has such a drain on human capital by needing to maintain a standing army, which always delays their young people from going into educational or professional services. So yes, the situation is not perfect. No, it is not the worst place on earth. Again, reminding us of why, if it is not the worst place on earth, neither in terms of poverty nor in terms of human rights violations by any measure, is this the fixation of so much of the world, that so much of the media attention focuses on this small strip of land in the Mediterranean. Also, people will say, if Israel ended the occupation of the Palestinians, or Iran, or Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, would no longer attack Israel or the US or others. Israel is often blamed as instigating all of these attacks from all of these different forces, either against Israel or against the US and other countries, simply by its occupation or existence. Well, Jews were attacked as soon as they began working their own farms decades before Israeli independence. So before 1948, before Israel was a country, before there was Jewish independence, before there was a Palestinian nation or even a Palestinian refugee, the Jews were already being attacked by other people in the region. The PLO was founded before Israel controlled the West Bank and Gaza, meaning before 1967, the Arabs already had established the PLO as a terrorist organization to eradicate Judaism and Jews from the entirety of what we call Israel. This was not about the occupation of the West Bank or Gaza. And indeed, radical Islam is a historical movement with seeds much deeper than the 20th century and Judaism. Israel is a focal point only because of its historical value and proximity to the Muslim world. If Israel weren't there, radical Islam would still be lashing out at other parts of the world. Regardless of what happens in Israel, radical Islam has ambitions against other Muslims, as we have seen play out far too often, and against other parts of the world. Oh. If you lived under occupation, you'd act like a terrorist too. This is one of the worst and my most offensive statements that I hear people say, because it simply makes a mockery of the fact that the vast majority of people that are poor or oppressed do not become terrorists. And as well, the most successful uprisings in the 20th century have been mostly nonviolent. If we look at the civil rights movement in America, if we look at the movement to secure the vote for women in America, if we look at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of democracy in Eastern Europe, time and time again, the most successful revolts against oppression have been nonviolent. Excusing all acts of terror and violence because of Israel's existence is simply making a mockery of the peaceful people of the world that have done more to change the world for good. You'll have heard very recently the common refrain, Israel's attack on Gaza in response to rocket fire is disproportionate. Well, if the occupation, as we saw a couple ticks ago, is thought to justify violence resistance that targets civilians, doesn't indiscriminate fire into civilian areas justify retaliation against the soldiers, the military that is launching the attacks? Right? If you are going to claim that if you are attacked, that you are allowed to retaliate with terrorist violence, then certainly Israel, when attacked by soldiers, should be allowed to respond. Israel, of course, does not respond with terrorist violence, but with as much restraint as is possible within the area that they are needing to strike to stop the fighting. But every country in the world strikes back when attacked with enough force to stop the attacks. That is simply what a country does to defend itself and its population. Think, for example, if someone threw a knife at you and only cut your arm, are you then only allowed to cut their arm in return? And then you hope that their next throw isn't more accurate? Or are you allowed to shoot them as they have already shown lethal intent from their initial attack? Just because a person is incapable of inflicting great harm with one attack does not mean we wait until they have before we try to stop them from future acts of violence. The establishment of intent is enough to need to stop the military of Gaza from carrying out further attacks. Also, you will hear people point out that the settlement activity prevents peace negotiations. We saw this just recently when Israel was authorizing the building of more housing. And people said, you can't do that, it'll only delay peace. Well, talks between parties that recognize the legitimate existence of each other do not need preconditions. You don't tell your spouse, I'll only go to marriage counseling if you make dinner every night from now on. You don't make preconditions before doing what is necessary if you value the relationship you're trying to build. Both sides have to be willing to talk, even if they dislike the current policies of the other. That's what negotiation means. The vast majority of settlement activity as well, you need to understand, is extending a few geographically linked suburbs of Jerusalem and not isolated mountaintop outposts. The 1967 borders were the 1948 ceasefire lines, and they have no intrinsic value to either side, and therefore are open to negotiation. So there is no magic green line that will always and forever be only Palestinian no matter what. There is the 1948 ceasefire that became the border that Israel crossed in 1967 for the Six-Day War. And eventually, in some negotiated settlement, there will be some amount of land swapping that goes back and forth. And it is my expectation that the areas that are close to Jerusalem will simply be amalgamated into Israel, and other land will be given to the newly made Palestinian state that will be of equal compensation. But that only happens if you actually sit down and negotiate. Putting preconditions on negotiation from either side, I will point out, is really not what it means to negotiate, and is usually done for domestic politics, not to move the cause of peace forward. All right, now we are running a little over, so I'm going to hold off on any questions until we get to the very, very end, just so I can make sure I get everything out that I need to get out. So we talked before about casual anti-Semitism, and I'd like to bring this up a little bit more for our finale. So many commentators, many preachers, politicians, and regular people continue to think of and to use and hold stereotypes of Jews that are based on many of the negative ideas we've talked about. When Jews are all thought to be cunning business people, financiers, or lawyers, that is anti-Semitism, even if it's meant as a compliment, and that is very important. It perpetuates a latent idea that we focus on money and scheme to acquire more. It also somehow excuses or calls out as being somehow illegitimate the rightful success of many Jewish people in business, finance, or law that have had to work and scrape and push themselves to the top of their professions, making it sound like that was a given simply because of their religious identity is simply pulling away the accomplishment that they have achieved. When people talk about Jewish racial features, big noses, swarthy skin, small stature, they are not engaging in anthropology. Right? This is not just describing what Jews look like, but they are perpetuating stereotypes that were chosen precisely because they are the opposite of the Western European ideals. Even before the increasing modern diversity of Judaism, we have had a broad range of physical features. The idea that Jews all look alike and that what we look alike happens to be the opposite of the European ideal, which is not limited to just the Aryan ideas of Nazi Germany, but was prominent throughout the 1800s and even before in all parts of Western Europe, is not accidental. We were labeled with those ideas, with those descriptions, precisely because they already hated us. It wasn't that they looked at us, described us, and then decided to dislike us. They disliked us, and so they described us. And now when they look at us, they see what they want to see, regardless of any relationship to the truth. And finally, you will often hear people say in passing in different ways of whether or not Jews are really loyal to America. In particular, in the United States, this stings because this country has been so good to us and we have tried to be so good to it. And yet, this idea that somehow we are less native to America than all of the other immigrants that have come here over the centuries is especially galling. And again, you will notice the hypocrisy that it is the Jews that are questioned about their loyalty. It is not the Italians or the Irish or people that come from other parts of the world. It is instead us, because this is latent anti-Semitism. It is not a legitimate question to ask whether a Jewish person is somehow of dual loyalty between Judaism or Israel and the United States, unless it is also a legitimate question to ask whether or not a Protestant has a dual loyalty to the place where their particular strand of Protestantism was formed, or to other Protestant people that might be in a adversarial position to the United States. It is simply not a question that works within the confines of this country in particular. All the members of this country are equal, and all should be assumed to have loyalty to this country, regardless of any additional affinity or affection that might be shown to other parts of the world. Now, when we try to measure this latent anti-Semitism, I'll point you to a very interesting report that was done by two professors in Europe. So, as you may know, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks in Europe, and also a rise in the disproportionate criticism of Israel. And of course, many people claim that their disproportionate criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. These two researchers decided that they would actually measure this, that just going by what people claim to be doing was not very effective. And so they asked people whether they had strong, or people who had strong anti-Israel sentiments, whether or not they also had strong anti-Jewish ideas, such as Jews have too much power in our country today. And when the statistics were done, the correlation was perfect. Out of 5,000 people who were surveyed, people who believe that Israeli soldiers intentionally target Palestinian civilians and that Palestinian suicide bombers who target Israeli civilians are justified, also believed that Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. Jews have a lot of irritating faults, pointing out that people that are anti-Semitic are likely to be anti-Israel in the more disturbing ways, and people who are anti-Israel in those disturbing ways are anti-Semitic. They will dislike the Jews of their own country, regardless of any support they may or may not show to Israel itself. That there is simply an anti-Jewish bias which feeds into their anti-Semitism towards Israel. However, it was important to note that there was only a small fraction of Europeans that actually believed either of those things. Much like the United States, despite the noise that comes out of Europe far too often, and despite the despicable acts of terrorism against Jews that happen in Europe far too often, it is a minority of Europeans that actually believe either of those things, the anti-Israel or the anti-Jewish attitudes. But of course, any that have those types of attitude are far too much. Now, when it comes time to defend ourselves against anti-Semitism, there is a particular problem, and this is a problem that's actually become more and more common, not only in our defense of anti-Semitism, but also in our defense against racism of all types, or discrimination against genders or against sexual identities. Really, the philosopher Sartre explained it best. The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith, right? At the outset, he has chosen to devalue words and reason, right? Understand, the anti-Semite is not an anti-Semite because he sat down and looked at all of the evidence and concluded with a rational understanding that Jews were bad and they deserve to be hated. He decided to hate Jews. It is a faith. It is an article of belief. It is not subject to reason or logical discussion. Therefore, how futile and frivolous discussions about the rights of the Jew appear to him. Why have a discussion about this? It's not subject to debate because it was not born out of discussion or logic. Now, if out of courtesy he consents for a moment to defend his point of view, he tries simply to project his intuitive certainty onto the plane of discourse. I hate Jews because they make servants insubordinate, meaning we make people uppity. Because a Jewish furrier robbed me, meaning he felt he got cheated by somebody and that person was Jewish. Now they know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge. An anti-Semite who tries to excuse why they hate Jews with some anecdotal evidence knows in their heart that the anecdote that they are providing is not sufficient grounds for the hate that they have. But they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he, the person attacking the anti-Semite, believes in words. When you have one person that is fighting for hate and another person that is fighting for goodness, unfortunately, the person fighting for goodness has to fight fair, and the person fighting for hate does not, because hate was not born out of any fair thinking. They, meaning the anti-Semites, like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reason, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. So when they have an argument and they are clearly being insane or crazy or speaking gibberish, it makes a mockery of the entire process. And nobody wants to have such discussions or debates because it just sounds ludicrous. Indeed, there was an issue recently where someone was saying that we needed to teach the opposing view of the Holocaust, and people chuckled uncomfortably because what would that mean? I mean, who would in their right mind defend the Holocaust? And that chuckle is entirely the point. The more you can make people think that this is a trivial issue because of the way the anti-Semites trivialize it, the less people are willing to engage and talk about the problem. It doesn't mean we need to engage with these people, but by discrediting the entire process and project, it means that there is less defense. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. This is why they shout and yell and swear and try to antagonize and threaten all that are in opposition to them, because they do not have logic to persuade, so they can only use intimidation. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, indicating that the time for argument is past. It is not that they are afraid of being convinced. They fear only to appear ridiculous or to prejudice by their embarrassment their hope of winning over some third person to their side. Ultimately, that is where we must be focusing our attention, recognizing that somebody that is a completely true to their cause anti-Semite is unlikely to be swayed by any discussion. Not impossible, but very unlikely. But we have to be very sensitive and on guard to how we can persuade those that are a third party, that are potential recruits among the anti-Semites or among any hate group, and potential allies among us and among all that stand against such hate and intolerance. And recognizing that when an argument is only serving the recruitment needs of those that are fighting for hate, and when to walk away and how to try and capture the allies that are needed to stand against them, that is something that we need to continue to be very careful in our process. We cannot descend to their level. We cannot hope to defeat them because their position is not one that can be defeated simply by conversation. And we will not be able to win people to our side by joining them down in that mud. However, we can continue to point out the ridiculousness of their endeavors, the lunacy of their ideas, and the fallacies that they have, and hold them up to ridicule and scorn, so that those that are anti-Semitic will be mocked and laughed at, which ultimately is the only place they belong within a society. And like I said, we were going to go late, and I have delivered on that promise. I certainly understand if people need to leave, but if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free. All right, then we will leave it there for tonight. Again, a happy Hanukkah to everyone. And as we enjoy our Hanukkah celebration, remember that ultimately the fight for the Maccabees was a fight for the freedom to be Jewish, just that. And that is a fight that is not over yet, unfortunately. Take care, everyone, and keep up the